All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the Hammer and Chisel Performance Podcast. I'm your host, John Heck. As always, before we dive into this conversation, I just want to give a quick shout out to the sponsors of the podcast. Troponin Supplements, as always, they're keeping me decked out in the cutoff tee, the power tee on the hat. And then before every episode, I take my ATP, 300 milligrams of caffeine, and then a powerful nootropic ingredient that is just, it gives me a good surge in focus, mental clarity, brings my mood up. And that's exactly what I need going into this podcast to have a great enlightening conversation. So anyway, speaking of which, getting into this conversation. So this is one that I'm really excited to have, not only for you guys to hear, but for my own personal education. That's part of the reason I love doing this podcast and having guests from all over the fitness industry, the performance world, the training and nutrition world, because I get to further my own education as well as bring the conversation to you guys. So this is a topic that admittedly I am not particularly well versed on, and that is the topic of peptides. Now, by the time you're hearing this, you'll probably have already heard my episode I released with Paul Barnett, where we went into the basics of anabolics and growth hormone and insulin. But we're going to go deep into peptides here. And I have a guest expert on, Anthony Castore. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really humbled to have the chance to talk to you, your audience, and excited to tell people about these peptides.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Castore?
Perfect. Yeah, most people mess it up and got it right out of the gate. Impressive.
Yes, sir. Well, I mean, you and I have been talking a little bit off the air, and I just alluded to it now. I would consider myself pretty well versed in the aforementioned anabolics, the growth hormone, the insulin, your traditional over-the-counter supplements, of course, and training, nutrition, all these things. Peptides are relatively new to me, and it really feels like they have exploded in popularity here in recent years, and there's a lot of them. They've got, complicated code names. It feels like, the sourcing is sort of gray. Okay, is this a legitimate source? Is this an illegitimate source? Are you really getting what you think you're getting? What is the proper application? Which ones of these are really, where's the juice worth the squeeze? So really curious to get into all this. But before we start, do you mind just giving a quick background resume on yourself?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So I've been in the training space for about 30 years. You can tell I'm old, bald, a little gray in the beard. When my journey began, I was at Purdue University, weighed about $117, dripping wet. Girlfriend was 118 pounds, so a pound more than me. And bars stayed open pretty late. We're out at bars, fight breaks out, across the bar. And she says, jokingly, but maybe seriously, you realize if that was a little closer over here, I might have had to jump in front. So that was kind of my, hey, I should probably start working out. And I went into, it's called Dr. Thayer's nutrition store. He was a chiropractor, nutrition store. And that's where I met Chad Coy. And Chad is the most incredible person, coach, mentor could have had. I mean, absolutely amazing. But what was so cool, I was dying to grow. And I went to boot camp basically with him. We took me from 117 pounds dripping wet up to $185, and I lost 2% body fat, and that was all natural. And I've always had a mind for science. Like, I love to know how things work, just naturally curious person. And that experience really kind of lit the fire. And I can honestly say, if it weren't for Chad, probably wouldn't be here talking to you today. So just so grateful for the experience, and training's a perfect spot for me to land in. The checks the box for curiosity, get to wear gym clothes to work, and the journey with the peptides really kind of began. They say those who can do, those who can't coach. So I'm one that can't. Would have loved to have done something in bodybuilding, but just really didn't. I could get into shape, but didn't have the size for it. But I love learning about the process, and as you learn about that process, inevitably you're going to come across all the supplementation around it. And bodybuilding in many ways is ahead of the rest of the world. And through that kind of digging, back in the 90s, I started reading about like IGF-1. And the one that really got me, and this is kind of funny, there's a peptide melanotin, and you can get a tan from it. And other than the fact I was small, so I wasn't going to go far in bodybuilding. Other reason I really didn't see myself having a future is because I don't know if you've smelled the Protan that the people put on.
Mhm.
It's horrible. Gets all over everything. I was like, no way, there's a peptide I can take that's going to make me tan. Perfect. So that was kind of where the beginning of researching peptides and that whole love of like, wow, this is amazing. There are these things that send signals in our body and can make us grow muscles. They can make us tan. They can make us smarter. And I just wanted to learn everything I could. So being the nerd I am, deep dive and haven't stopped since.
Understood. Well, that curiosity, I love that, and that's something that I have, and it's something that I think can help take you far. Because if you're always a student of the game, right, you're never satisfied with the current knowledge you have. You're always looking to expand your toolbox. That's going to push you always to be better. And as a coach myself, getting to have conversations with guys like you, further my own education and add additional tools to my toolbox. It's something I love to do. So, just getting into the peptides themselves here. Can you just define peptide for the audience? What exactly is a peptide?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about a peptide, I like to make things really simple. So if you can imagine, we've got two amino acids over here. It doesn't matter which ones. And let's say there's a peptide bond in between them. So now they're joined together. And what we have is a peptide. And when we think about different peptides in the body, if they're 2 to 4 amino acids long, these are going to be bioregulator peptides. And it kind of makes sense if we think about how small 2 to 4 amino acids would be, that they can kind of sneak in and make epigenetic changes. So sort of rewire our DNA to how it's supposed to be. And most of those are going to be things that are going to work on specific organs or systems. So for instance, like there's a kidney bioregulator, a heart bioregulator, those sorts of things. Now, when that chain gets a little bit longer, up to 45 amino acids, that's standard definition of a peptide. And some simple ones, just to kind of give some context for people. Everybody probably has seen the Ozempic. Gosh, I got a terrible singing voice. But that's a semaglutide, which is going to be peptide, and BPC 157, 15 amino acids long, thymosin beta 4. All these essentially are going to be under that 45 amino acid mark. And the way these peptides work is they send signals. They talk to our cells. So it's kind of like they go over, they tap the cell on the shoulder in the case of like semaglutide, and they say, hey, after we eat that meal, we want to regulate our blood sugars a little bit better. So I need you to do this, this, and this. So just kind of like a supervisor. But their whole mechanism of action basically is signaling. And what I like to explain to people when we're talking about these peptides that are 45 amino acids or less, it's kind of like you got a really, really nice stereo, and you can play it all the way up to 10 and it's going to be crisp audio, but there's no 11 on that dial. So in the context of peptides, what that means is when we think about the best version of ourselves, like if we're expressing our DNA perfectly, the way that, the best it can, how we were designed to optimally function, peptides are going to turn a couple dials up, they're going to turn a couple dials down, but they're going to dial us in to where we've got optimal cell signaling. Now, the first peptide that we discovered was or is insulin, and insulin, more than 45 amino acids. It's gonna, and sounds like you've got a lot of knowledge around this, so you can add that in, and you can have super physiologic amounts of insulin, and if you do it wrong, there can be some consequences. And then when we think about even longer peptide sequences, so like growth hormone, 191 amino acids long, that's going to be like a polypeptide. So all these are peptides. Kind of how we differentiate is going to be because of how many amino acids are in a sequence. The mechanism of action, are they signaling or are they adding to something? And little small ones, or they're kind of sneaking in there on that DNA and making a few micro adjustments.
Understood. Okay. Thank you for that. And, before we kind of dive into some of the specific peptides and talking about, their mechanisms and applications and all these things, I just want to just talk about sort of the history and timeline of these. And I know you mentioned insulin being sort of the first discovered exogenous peptide here. It feels like peptides are a relatively new thing, or at least the popularity of these exogenous peptides, it feels relatively new. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think they really, probably even just within the last 10 years,
Right.
really become a lot more prevalent. There was research being done on them, dating back to early 2000s, but it was all, like lab setting type of stuff and not very accessible. So at this point, we've got access to them. There's a ton of research on them, although I'd say the majority of it is animal models and anecdotal data. So people who have used these and are talking about them. And um, so, yeah, I guess hopefully that answers the question in terms of timeline.
Yeah, it does. And are there varying degrees of legality with various peptides? Because obviously, when we talk about anabolics, we're talking about a scheduled drug, right? That is federally illegal. Although there are certain anabolics that have a medical application and can be prescribed. And then, growth hormone, insulin, although not scheduled federally illegal substances, obviously these things are prescription only. When it comes to the peptides, it feels like there's this sort of gray area market. You can purchase them legally online, but some of these have the caveats. Oh, these are research chemicals, not for human use. Wink, wink. Right. What is the general landscape of the legality and ability to safely acquire most of these peptides?
So you're exactly right. When we talk about access, legality, that sort of thing, none of the peptides are scheduled. However, if you want to get something like legit, that's what I would encourage people to do, go through a compounding pharmacy. Um, there's going to be oversight on that. And kind of an interesting example, if we talk about BPC. So that and a couple other peptides were put on a FDA Schedule 2 lists where they can't be compounded into an injectable, but the compounding pharmacy can make them into an oral formulation in the case of BPC. Um, to your point, it's kind of the Wild West out there when we look at these research vendors. Some of them say third party tested, but the challenge is, I mean, anybody with a little bit of skill in Adobe uh, can generate a certificate of analysis, whole thing.
Right.
So you're really kind of taking a gamble. And I think a couple things keep people from going the legitimate route. One, a lot of doctors just right now, it's still kind of new and they don't really have the knowledge. And, with their medical license on the line, it's kind of a big step for them. And then when we look at the cost in a compounding pharmacy versus a research chemical vendor, it's going to be a lot more expensive. But what I explain to people is, there's no better investment you can make than your health. And when we're talking about something that you're injecting into your body that's going to be sending signals, it makes a lot more sense to me to cut out, Starbucks every day and pay a little bit more for something coming from the compounding pharmacy than
Right.
kind of take that gamble to save a few bucks on peptides. But that being said, there are some good research vendors out there that really, a lot goes into making their product. But in terms of my advice on that, I would say work with an expert that, one, can put together the appropriate peptide stack for you, and two, is going to have access to the compounding pharmacy. So you're not taking that gamble.
Understood. Yeah, that's always been something I've been worried about because I work with a lot of athletes and clients who are interested in peptides or who are using peptides, and the first thing that pops in my mind is, okay, where are you getting this from?
Yeah.
Someone will say, oh, I'm on, these 5 different peptides, and of course they just bought them online from the first research chemical vendor that they found on Google. And I've always been skeptical about this. You know, you look at the SARMs world, right? And then it turns out, you know, a vast or a large percentage of the SARMs out there are, you know, they're not what the label says they are. They're underdosed, whatever. And, you know, I had concerns that the same was probably occurring with
Absolutely.
peptides. Okay, so anyone listening to this, if you are going to utilize the peptides, like you said, go through a legitimate source, work with an expert, make sure that these are coming from a compounding pharmacy or at least a research chemical vendor that has been legitimately vetted, and you have legitimate reason to believe that they're providing legitimate products. But okay, getting into some of the peptides and mechanisms themselves, you and I talked off the air beforehand, and you were helpful in guiding some of these touch points, because you know, when I'm looking at all the peptides, there's a million. I don't know where to start, right? So
Yeah.
you gave me some that would be interesting to touch on. So I've got my notes here. And one of the first things that you mentioned was talking about the peptides versus the anabolics, the growth hormone, the insulin, in terms of their mechanistic differences, where the peptides shine in comparison to the aforementioned performance enhancers. So, you know, you talk about tissue repair, neuroregeneration, mitochondrial function, metabolic flexibility, things like that. So let's start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's interesting, you know, when we look at like an exogenous growth hormone versus like GHRH, GHRP combo, and we think, you know, they're both stimulating or increasing the amount of growth hormone in our system. And we ask ourselves, you know, why would one be better for one situation or another be better for another situation? So, good place to start probably is when we think about um, recombinant 191 amino acid growth hormone. And we kind of think about like what happens in our body. So in our body, there's over 100 different isoforms of growth hormone. And when I say isoform, essentially that refers to when growth hormone is pulsed out, and it can be 7 to 10 times a day. What are going to be the downstream effects? What are the signals being sent? And when we look at that 191 amino acid growth hormone, when we take that, it's going to be kind of a one size fits all piece, and it's going to have a really strong mTOR signal and going to be fantastic for repair. And at first, you know, that sounds excellent. And I'm certainly not down on growth hormone at all. But what I want people to think about is uh, we have to have balance between AMPK and mTOR. And let me explain that a little bit more so it makes more sense. Um, Imagine you got a really nice sports car, and AMPK, we're going to call that the brake pedal, and mTOR, we're going to call that the gas pedal. And if you go out in this sports car and, you know, pedal to the metal, you're just flooring it the whole time, you know, you're going to have a lot of fun. But uh, without having a brake on there, if a cop shoots his laser at you, you're going to be in trouble, and you're going to run out of gas, and you're going to put a lot of wear and tear on that vehicle. And if we don't have that brake applied, sometimes where we can pull over, you know, change the tires, we can decrease the speed if we need to, that sort of thing. Um, we're not going to have we're not going to get much out of that vehicle. Now,
Yep.
conversely, you know, let's say we're super conservative. We got that same car, and, you know, it could go 220 miles an hour, but we're afraid to take our foot off the brake. We're never going to experience it. So when we talk about AMPK and mTOR and what they do, mTOR is going to be really important for things like protein synthesis and imprintation of long-term memories, um, repairing nerves, stuff like that. And AMPK is going to be, that's like our cleanup crew. That's going to sweep out, you know, the dead senescent cells. That's going to increase insulin sensitivity. So kind of fine tuning our ability to have that metabolic flexibility in there for where we can use carbohydrates, where we can use fats, sort of flipping back and forth. So there's a value to both of those. Um, when we think about these GHRH, GHRPs, what they're doing is the the magnitude of response is going to be a lot lower than if you're taking growth hormone. And the time that they're telling us to pulse out the growth hormone is going to be a lot lower. For example, sermorelin, that's a commonly used one. That's going to be like a 10 to 20 minute half-life. And so when we're thinking about AMPK, mTOR, and, growth hormone versus GHRH, GHRP, to give you a couple different scenarios where one might make more sense than another. If you've got situation where you're coming back from an injury, would probably really want to drive protein synthesis. So it might make a little bit more sense. That might be a situation where we could lean a little bit more on growth hormone, or as we get older, and if somebody's got a defective pituitary gland, growth hormone is going to be a better choice. Now, if we're thinking kind of throughout the year, it might make sense to do a GHRH, GHRP combo, because we're still going to get that pulsing of growth hormone, and we're still going to get a lot of really cool benefits with it. In fact, my favorite, one of my favorites is the tesamorelin. Tesamorelin was originally developed for AIDS patients with lipodystrophy, where essentially they're storing fat in weird places. And tesamorelin can enhance the electron transport chain function. And it does this, it upregulates mitochondrial biogenesis. And it also increases the PGC1 alpha, which is basically like going to drive up some of the things that rule our antioxidant system. So, in terms of redox, and redox is just like losing or gaining electrons and the balance between that. Tesamorelin's got some really cool benefits there, as well as it lowers circulating fatty acids. So another kind of cool thing, if let's say we got somebody that's just prepared for a bodybuilding show or an event where they were taking a lot of anabolics and their lipid panel is screwed. One of the fastest way to kind of get that stuff back in track, and still, maintain an anabolic environment, would be using something like a tesamorelin. So it's not necessarily that I would say one is better than the other. It's more, you have to look at the situation and you have to think, is this a situation where I want to kind of have that balance between AMPK, mTOR, or is this a acute situation where I really need to drive mTOR? What am I taking it for?
Got it. And when you talk about the GHRHs, GHRP combos,
Mhm.
would the proper term be a growth hormone analog, a growth hormone mimetic? Am I off with that?
No, that's a good way to describe it. GHRH, essentially a growth hormone releasing hormone.
Yeah.
And when we kind of think about how those are going to be working, those basically, trying to think of an easy way to explain it, they are going to bind to that GHRH receptor on the anterior pituitary, and that's going to increase the cyclic AMP and GH release. And then when we think about like a GHRP, like a growth hormone releasing peptide, those have a little more activity in like the ghrelin pathway. So, like GHRP2, for instance, that can really drive up appetite on people. So uh, both of them stimulate growth hormone, but through a little bit different mechanism. And then when we look at the different options there, um, that's going to have more to do with like if you look at tesamorelin versus sermorelin, the same way they're increasing growth hormone or pulsing that growth hormone out, but the half-life is going to be different. So we've got a lot of different variables we can kind of juggle.
Right. And you mentioned the ghrelin driving up hunger. Is MK677, would that fall under one of these categories?
Yeah, so
Lumped into this?
MK677 is a really interesting one. It's really cool in the sense that it pulls a lot of water into the cell. So it's not uncommon to see some good weight gain on that. Drives up IGF, but in terms of how we categorize it, it's a non-peptide GHSR1A agonist. So uh, That sounds like a bunch of alphabet soup. The way I explain it to people so it makes a little bit more sense is when we're thinking about that, um, it's essentially kind of going to do like a GHRH and GHRP all rolled into one.
Got it. And just, when we talk about these growth hormone releasing peptides, medics, analogs, is it true to say that you're ultimately still bound by your own endogenous production? Like, it's not going to take you to super physiological levels. Would that be correct? You're just basically
Yeah,
maxing out your endogenous abilities?
that's exactly right. And that's really kind of the key difference when we think about a GHRH, GHRP combo versus like exogenous growth hormone. Exogenous growth hormone, we're adding growth hormone into the system, so we can put more in than we'd ever make. With a GHRP, GHRH, or something like the MK677, we're not going to make. It's not going to allow us to make more than we're capable of making. So it can take us right up to that ceiling, but not past it.
Right. And that's one of the arguments I occasionally hear against these peptides is, oh, you're still bound by your own endogenous production. This is barely enough to move the needle. Just get on the true growth hormones. You can actually experience super physiological results. But you opened up by saying, okay, well, the growth hormone, it's great, but you're just slamming down on the gas pedal, which comes with, its downsides, right? What are some of those downsides? Just to start off, we can talk about, the insulin resistance that could
Yeah.
potentially cause by blasting growth hormone, and what are some of the other ones, or is that the primary one you're concerned about?
That is the primary one I'm concerned about. There's some research that indicates it can have negative impacts on the podocyte and the kidney, probably coming from fluid retention. But the insulin is kind of the biggest one. And when we think about like, well, what's happening? Why is this happening? When we have something that's really mTOR driven, and think about like when we're weight training, if we're weight training, we're gonna be using creating energy primarily through glycolytic pathways. And when we think about like the amount of ATP that yields, it's going to be significantly less than, if we're doing like a Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation type of thing. And what ends up happening because it's less and we're relying on glucose to fuel the cell is we're just driving glucose into the cells, driving it, and we're still breaking down fat. Growth hormone creates lipolysis where we're breaking down those fatty acids, but because primarily glucose is what's going in, one, we're going to become insulin resistant because there's just mitochondria is not doing a good job of keeping up with that when you overwhelm it. And two, because we have these circulating fatty acids, that's where we start to see things like fatty liver, loss of metabolic flexibility. So, um, and that kind of comes back to that balancing AMPK mTOR that when we just take those, when we kind of respect the body's natural rhythms and that sort of thing, and we get those big pulses of growth hormone. And the beauty of it is, I mean, you can do that multiple times a day. Um, then we've still got the balance in there where we've got that cleanup and that fine tuning of mitochondria for insulin sensitivity, utilization, as well as using fatty acids. So
Yeah,
hope that kind of answers the question.
yeah, absolutely. And I have one more question on the topic,
Mhm.
and we can move on to the some other peptides. But with growth hormone, there's always this debate, this discussion about the timing of when to take it. Right? There's some that say take it first thing in the morning fasted. There's some that say take it right before bed, or wake up in the middle of the night and take it, or take it after training. Right? Um, what are some of your thoughts on the timing of actual growth hormone, and then some of the real world applications of the timing of some of these growth hormone driving peptides?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about growth hormone, um, and when we're going to have the biggest pulse of growth hormone, it's going to be at night. So if we're going to be doing growth hormone, my suggestion would be to do it before you go to bed.
Mm.
That's going to kind of match your natural biology. And then when we think about GHRH, GHRPs, those would also be done before bed. Now, the difference is I wouldn't tell somebody to do growth hormone in the morning. You know, a lot of people growth hormone in the morning before fasted cardio. But if you look at how long it takes to achieve like peak concentration and, you know, really maxing out that lipolysis, uh, unless you're waking up at like 4 a.m. and hopping on the treadmill around 8, you're probably missing the mark. And that might be a better opportunity to do something like a Sermorelin, where you're going to get that pulse right away, you know, 15-minute half-life. And um, then when we talk about like post-workout, that kind of thing, um, to me, and this would be kind of a whole nother area, but there's a lot better things you can use after a workout than growth hormone. The growth hormone, the benefit to taking it after a workout is going to be to drive IGF. But
Right.
when we really think about what happens when we're breaking down that muscle tissue when there's trauma, we're going to release a splice of IGF, which is the pegylated PEG. And that is just, or actually it's just MGF that we release, but you can get pegylated, the PEG MGF, and that's going to be a longer acting form. And what it does is it signals, you know, all these cells to come over and begin the repair process. So post-workout, if we do a PEG MGF, that is reinforcing the signal of, hey, there was trauma, we need to rebuild, and it's going to recruit a bunch of cells. And then the next day, that's when we do the IGF-1 in the morning, like a long R3 that's going to have the systemic effects. Because what the IGF-1 does is it's going to essentially take those unidentified cells and mature them into muscle cells. So now we're being really strategic about it. And then if we've got our growth hormone at night, where we're maximizing, you know, our sleep, our recovery, that sort of thing. And mTOR, if we think about it, and this is an oversimplification, generally speaking, like when we're sleeping, that's going to be an mTOR dominant state because that's when we're repairing and rebuilding. And during the day, there are peaks and valleys, but the day is going to be more of an AMPK dominant time because essentially that's where we're breaking things down. That's where we're really testing our metabolic flexibility. So does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah. So would it be fair to say, okay, if you're running your true growth hormone, take it before bed, you know, don't bother in the morning. It's going to take too long to reach concentration in the system. You're sort of missing the point if you're taking that before your fasted cardio, but rather use the peptides to sort of sharpshoot during the day to you know, get a quicker, shorter, more focused effect. Would that be a fair simplification of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing to think about too, you know, when we wake up and we have that cortisol high like we want, and it's breaking down things essentially, that's the process that then, you know, next step is cleaning up things that were broken down. So if we take growth hormone in the morning where we're sending that mTOR dominant signal, even though we're breaking tissue down, we're negating the cellular cleanup. So that's where we start to get kind of a higher senescent burden. So yeah, 100%. If you're going to do 191 amino acid, I think the smart thing to do would be do it in the evening.
Right.
And kind of respect the natural circadian rhythms that we have during the day.
Understood. Guys, thank you for tuning in and supporting the podcast. I just wanted to take a minute to give a shout out over to my guys at Troponin Supplements. So they're the sponsor of the podcast, and in my opinion, they carry the best supplements on the market, and it's not even close. And they're the one company that I've wanted to align myself with. As a nutrition coach working with NFL football players, other professional athletes, strongman competitors, bodybuilders, powerlifters, fitness enthusiasts, endurance athletes, I have to be very particular about any supplement company I endorse. And with Troponin Supplements, frankly, it was a no-brainer. These are the products I've been using myself for the last few years before I ever became involved with the company. I know the owner personally, Justin Harris. He is one of the brilliant minds in the bodybuilding industry, and we've talked, and all he has wanted to do is just bring some of the elite top-of-the-line products to the market, and that's what he's done. So these are the products I recommend and endorse to all my athletes, all my clients. I use myself, and I want to pass this along to you guys as well. So I'm going to highlight a couple products here. First and foremost, We've got the ATP. This is a high dose of caffeine paired with a very powerful nootropic. I take this before work. I take this before I podcast. This is going to give you a great boost in mood, in focus, memory enhancement. You're just going to feel like you took the Limitless pill when you use ATP. It's an effervescent tablet. You drop it in your water, it dissolves, tastes great. The next product, Field Rations. This is the premier intra-workout supplement on the market right now. It's a one-stop shop for all your intra-workout needs. It's based in highly branched cyclic dextrin, contains essential amino acids, electrolytes, tastes amazing. I use this within every training session. Then we've got the Suppressor Max. This is awesome for controlling your blood sugar. It's got a high dose of berberine, but then has complementary ingredients that are going to keep the berberine bioavailable and stay in your system longer. This is the best blood sugar product on the market. If you're bulking, if you're eating a ton of food, if you're using a cheat meal, this is a great product for you. And then finally, I love this one. I've always had sleep issues. Hit the Rack. This is one of the best sleep products I've ever tried. I use it about 30 minutes before bed most nights, and this has been the one supplement that has actually helped me fall asleep and stay asleep. And then of course, we got the Troponin T logo bodybuilding jersey and the hat. We've got great apparel on the site. So guys, check out Troponin supplements. You can find the link in the show notes, in the bio, or you can simply just Google Troponin supplements. Use code HECK, capital HECK, at checkout for a discount. Check them out, guys. These are some of the best products on the market.
Okay. Well, just moving on then to, and like we talked about this at the beginning, we could probably do a whole podcast on any one of these specific topics, but just for the sake of kind of touching on all these things, I'm going to keep things moving. And let's move on to the healing peptides. These are very popular. Of all the peptides, this is the area where, okay, I do have some personal experience and know a lot of people who use these things. The BPC 157s, the TB 500s, and you put one on my radar I was unfortunately unfamiliar with the ARA 290. So let's go into some of the healing peptides, applications, what to expect from them, how to properly apply them. Let's start with BPC 157 and TB 500. Those are some of the most popular out there.
Yeah, so BPC 157, it's I feel like they could put that in the drinking water. There's so many benefits. When we look at what it does, it increases angiogenesis, and there was some I think it was Dr. Prisk talked about cancer risk, but I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with him on that, because when we look at the angiogenesis, which is basically the creation of a better vascular supply, they call them runner veins, creating runner veins. It's specific to where the injury's at. So when we have an injury, one of the challenges is going to be getting blood supply there that allows us to put the things in we need to repair and take the things out that are broken. So it increases, it's called VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor. It also increases nitric oxide. And it also promotes fibroblast migration. And it also modulates FAK paxillin signaling and increases the density of growth hormone receptors, as well as repairs mucosal lining in the gut. So I know I covered a ton of stuff, but let's focus on a few of those that are probably going to be the most important to the audience here. Going back to our discussion on growth hormone, how can we get more out of growth hormone without having to take more? Well, if we take BPC 157 by increasing that density of growth hormone receptors, we're going to be more responsive to it. So we're going to get more out of less. Also, when we think about neuronal nitric oxide, we need that to contract a muscle. So something that's going to upregulate that is going to be really helpful for our lifting efforts. And when we talk about, repairing the mucosal lining in the gut, one of the things that they find in people that really push the envelope with their training, for all the benefit that comes with that, it can cause leaky gut. Those tight cellular junctions in the stomach start to kind of come apart, and it compromises that mucosal lining. So a good way to kind of protect against that when you're training really hard is BPC 157.
Yeah, and let's touch on just injectable versus oral. BPC 157. So one question that I have about the injectable version, let's say we're coming off of an injury, we're talking more of a tissue injury repair application. I hear some debate on this as well. Do you need a localized site injection? Let's say you're dealing with a torn pec. You're coming off of a pectoral surgery. In order to really maximize the healing effect for the pec, are we needing to do site injections around the area, or are we just going systemic with a subcutaneous injection in the belly fat?
It's a really good question. And I've also been asked about like the oral and intranasal and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So the easiest way to explain this, I like to use analogy. So imagine your body is a city, and you've got this highway running around it, which is your bloodstream. And let's say, you have that pec tear. And if we've got an entrance ramp right where that pec tear is at, so we do an injection of BPC. Imagine you got a car with, or a van with 10 workers in it. All 10 of those workers, that's the first injury they see. So they're all going to start working on that area. So in terms of uh, having 100% of that basically applied to that injury, that's going to be the most effective. Now, conversely, if we take a capsule, do an intranasal, or do like a sub-Q in the belly, what's going to happen is that car is going to drive around, or van's going to drive around. And let's say you have some of that compromised mucosal layer. 2 of those workers are going to jump out and start working on that. And let's say you got a little inflammation in your other shoulder, 4 of the workers are going to jump out. And let's say your nitric oxide's low, and they're like, 2 of us can fix this. So they jump out. Pretty soon you got the driver and a passenger to fix that whole pec. Whereas if you went in through the entrance ramp on your pec instead of your mouth or your nose or your stomach, you're getting all 10 of those working on the problem.
And that would apply as well, that same concept. If you did the subcutaneous belly fat injection, it would go to work all over the place, as opposed to specific, if you did the local injection.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. Now, an issue I wonder about is when you have an injury that's in an area that's difficult to inject in, right? Let's say you're dealing with an ankle, something like that, where there's no easy, you're probably not going to be injecting into your ankle or anywhere near your, like Achilles tendon or soleus. How do you navigate that?
A couple options would be, there's topical forms of BPC, so you could have it compounded as a topical. You could also just kind of go, like we'll say the calf, which is going to be closer to the area. It's not exactly there, but going back to the analogy of the van full of 10 drivers, probably 8 of them are going to get over there. So it's going to
Okay,
be
so just
more.
as long as you're getting a little bit closer proximity, that is going to help.
Yeah, the closer the proximity, the more of that peptide is going to be signaling in that area.
Now, going back to the pec, does this need, or should this ideally be an intramuscular injection, or can it still be subcutaneous?
Yeah, we want to do sub-Q with the BPC.
Understood. And then, when it comes to the gut related issues, and this is something I've had my own personal issues with a lot, just severe GERD, acid reflux, leaky gut. And I used oral BPC 157, and of everything I tried, that was the one thing that gave me substantial relief.
Yeah.
Would the only way to target a gut issue with BPC 157 be with the oral version, or could, the subcutaneous belly fat injection also apply to this?
Yeah, the subcutaneous can work with that. In fact, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I've got a combo that I use for people with gut issues. I won't get into doses, but I'd be happy to talk about what the combo is. And so we would be using BPC 157, KPV, TUDCUT. It's capital T, capital U, capital D, capital C, capital A.
Mm-hmm.
Lactulose, which is oddly a prescription, but it's just essentially it's more or less a sugar. and we would use butyrate supplementation and lorazepam. And if you use that combination with somebody with a gut issue, and colostrum, I would be amazed if you weren't able to fix it.
Yeah, understood. And actually, several of the compounds you mentioned, the product I was using, it was a combination with several of those. And I'd been dealing with this issue for over a year, and then finally tried that. And what do you know? I found a lot of relief from it. Okay, so, let's say you're just dealing with someone who they've aches and pains. They've got a million things going on with them. They're a strongman competitor. Their body is just beat down. Would just a simple systemic belly shot injection of BPC 157 be a good way to sort of address everything that's going on?
So there's a couple things that would be really helpful for a strongman competitor, anybody that's kind of got that systemic inflammation. That would be where we'd use BPC. Then we'd also want to use the thymosin beta 4. Thymosin beta 4 is going to regulate actin polymerization, and it also works synergistically for that angiogenesis. So when we talk about what that means, that is going to essentially, like when you have damage to those actin filaments, it's rebuilding those. And the combination of those synergistically align collagen. So you have these nice straight lines of collagen like we're supposed to. In addition to that, something, and it's not a peptide, but it should be on people's radar, would be pentacin polysulfate. This stuff's amazing. I mean, it literally regenerates cartilage, and it reduces all the inflammatory cytokines associated with both COVID and arthritis. And it even works as a prebiotic. So that's another one of my go-tos for that systemic inflammation. And then, believe it or not, and this one goes under everybody's radar, is something as simple as, and I'm really specific about which one, it would be the ketone ester, BHB by Ketone Aid. And I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I wish I was. But that's going to reduce those inflammatory cytokines. It's going to decrease histone deacetylation, which is where we have these genes that are programmed to be inflammatory, and they're wrapped up, and we don't want them to essentially unwrap and replicate. It's going to decrease the incidence of that. And it also improves, in terms of energy production, your NAD plus to NAD pH ratio, which is going to be, when we talk about what that is, outside of being a bunch of numbers and letters, it's that simple ratio basically governs when our cells are getting electrons or giving electrons away. And that's what regulates, like, making sure we don't have reactive oxygen species, and making sure that our cell has enough energy to repair. So BPC, thymosin beta 4, pentacin, and ketone esters would be amazing start for somebody with that systemic inflammation.
Got it. I'm trying to stay focused on the podcast here, but you're talking and my mind's going like to my own potential protocols. Like, geez, I need to start writing this down to be formulating my own protocol, because my body is taking a beating over the years from football and strongman, and I'm just held together by duct tape at this point. But I may talk to you off the air a little bit later. But okay, what about TB 500? We covered BPC 157 ad nauseum. Of course, TB 500 is the other one you always hear about, and oftentimes you hear used in combination with the BPC 157. So can you just give an overview of TB 500, and is there a necessity to combine it with BPC 157 when dealing with an injury?
Yeah, so TB 500, when we talk about thymosin beta 4, which is thymic peptide, 43 amino acids long, TB 500 essentially is like the research name for that. And where it gets a little bit confusing, so I want to make sure I'm making this as clear to people as possible. TB 500 can either mean thymosin beta 4, same thing, 43 amino acids, research version, or it could be 17 amino acid structure, or, and this is where it gets a little confusing, we can have TB 500 fragments. And the ones that are most commonly looked at are going to be fragment 1 through 4. So when we think about 43 amino acids, that's 1, 2, 3, and 4. and then 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So 17 through 23. And when we think about this 43 amino acid peptide, thymosin beta 4, it has some regulatory effects in our immune system, on senescence, on tissue repair, inflammation, all that stuff. When we look at these little fragments, um, like for example, 17 through 23 is going to uh, be a lot more specific to just repairing, like with the actin polymerization we were talking about. And sometimes people say, well, why would you want a fragment versus the whole thing? Because you get all these other benefits with thymosin beta 4. And the answer would be, when we talk about that shorter chain, one, the signaling is going to be a lot more specific. So maybe you don't need that immune modulation. Maybe you just need to repair those actin filaments. And it's going to be orally bioavailable because it's a smaller sequence of amino acids. So for people that maybe the barrier to entry is fear of giving themselves a shot, or even in terms of like how frequently we can dose it, it might not be practical to give yourself a shot 3 times a day, but you can easily pop a capsule 4 times a day, whatever.
Understood. And just speaking of dosing, that's one I should cover, and I glossed over this with the BPC 157. Do you have a recommended dosing protocol? Whether it's a micrograms per kilogram type recommendation, or AM, PM. Do you mind just touching on just some generalized recommendations for both the BPC 157 and the TB 500?
Yeah, so with BPC 157, the saturation dose is going to be 400 micrograms. And to clarify on that, that doesn't mean if you take 500 micrograms, 100 of it's not working. That means that 100 is going to work a lot less than that first 400. So in terms of half-life, it's got a relatively short half-life. Off the top of my head, I think it's 4 hours, but it might be 6 hours. That being said, optimal way to do BPC is going to be like 250 micrograms or 400 micrograms, at least twice a day, and maybe more frequently, because then one, you're keeping it in the system. Two, you're staying within that saturation dose, so you're using all of it. So in my opinion, that is probably going to be the best way to do it. I know I've looked at some research where safely they've used up to, it would be like a couple milligrams. Not telling people to run out and do that, but doesn't seem like there have been any negative side effects observed. With the thymosin beta 4, that's another one. When we look at generally, our repair cycle is going to happen when we're sleeping. So kind of thymosin 101, we would start with something like maybe 500 micrograms 3 times a week. However, in the case of like TBI or a stroke, like milligrams have been used to that. I've seen up to 10 milligrams for TBIs, and seen some really amazing things in terms of what can happen when somebody has a stroke and you give them a really high dose of thymosin beta 4. So that's one of the things with these peptides that I'm not going to say there's no side effects, but there's a lot bigger safety net in there. And the amount you're going to take, I always tell people, minimum effective dose, to start with the least amount. So 250 on the BPC, 500 on the thymosin beta 4, and then kind of gauge your response. If you need to go up from that, do that, maybe that same dose twice a day. And if you need to go up from that, 3 times a day. So kind of everybody's going to have a little different response, and there's some reasons for that. But I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, and then this might be a stupid question, but I've seen some talk about this as well. Does it matter empty stomach, without food, when it comes to the application of these?
My preference is to do it 15 to 20 minutes before a meal.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about like injecting, I don't think it would really matter.
Sure.
If we're talking about the oral, I think I haven't this is just theoretical, so this is just my thoughts on it. When we eat food, when we break down our proteins, there's amino acids floating around that have been cleaved. So to make sure that our body's focusing on the specific sequence that is one of these peptides, the less noise we have around it, the more it can kind of zero in on what that message is.
Understood. So if you're using an oral form, ideally, 15, 20 minutes before a meal. If you're using the injectable form, doesn't really matter. And then my last question on the healing peptides, you talked about the TBIs, the stroke application. Have these found their way into mainstream medicine? Are physicians utilizing these as well?
Yeah, so I'm a part of an organization. It's called the Seed Scientific Research and Performance, and I'm the first non-physician to make a fellowship with them. The organization is physicians and brightest physicians in the country, in the world, and they use these regularly in their practice for all sorts of things. You know, chronic illness, TBI. Really amazing the stuff they're doing, and such a privilege for me to be able to learn from them. But yes, these are, and it's starting. We're getting a lot of momentum. There's a lot more people that are joining the organization to learn. So they're definitely getting momentum, and I feel like probably 5 years from now, it's going to be commonplace that you would go to a doctor and they'd say, you had a TBI, and they'd say, all right, let's order up some thymosin beta 4, some neuropeptides, and that would be the primary line of defense.
Right. And, sort of going down this topic a little bit with, a medical application,
Mhm.
BPC 157, I know, and maybe TB 500 as well, recently became WADA banned, which I can't for the life of me figure out why you would want athletes not to legally have access to this. I mean, athletes who are getting injured, who are taking a beating, and it seems there's no performance, alleged performance enhancing benefits. It's purely a great healing modality. Why on earth have these been outlawed in sport?
I agree with you completely, especially like prophylactically, if you're taking BPC 157 or thymosin beta 4,
Sure.
and even the ketone esters, that's going to greatly improve outcomes from TBI. The reason that the BPC was banned is because of the increase in density of growth hormone receptors. And then the reason and the improvement in neuronal nitric oxide, so better contractility of the muscle. The thymosin beta 4, I don't know for sure on that. I'm guessing it's because of the proliferation of satellite cells, and that regeneration of actin filaments. It's kind of a stretch in my opinion, but
Right.
there could certainly be some anabolic effects, but I don't think enough that's gonna win a gold medal or anything.
Yeah, it seems like a damn shame to take the access to these away from athletes who could greatly benefit from this, in just a number of just positive ways, extending careers. And anyway, I'm not going to get on the soapbox there, but for the sake of time, I'm just I'll move us on to the next category of let's start here. Before there's so many we can cover, but go more into the realm of hypertrophy, performance enhancement, and fat loss. Do you see any of the, and some of these we've probably already covered with some of the growth hormone release peptides could fall under this with performance enhancement, but do you see any peptides having a legitimate application in the hypertrophy realm?
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about like the IGF, the MGF, and one of the things, one of the combos I'll use for hypertrophy, if somebody's trying to increase muscle size or performance, would be like the MGF, the IGF. There's a peptide that's called cerebrolysin. It's used overseas primarily for like TBI and neurodegenerative diseases, but it increases synaptogenesis and regenerates nerve. So you can do that intramuscularly. And with that combo that we talked about earlier with the MGF, the IGF, and you can see some pretty amazing things happen. It's really cool. Um, on top of that, I think uh, when we talk about health, performance, hypertrophy, anything, we can't skip over the mitochondria. And when we can do things to the mitochondria that's going to translate into improved energy production, metabolic flexibility, that's 100% going to correlate with hypertrophy and performance in my experience. And that's where we get into some stuff like MOTS-C, um, SS31, the 5-amino-1-MQ. These sound like alphabet soup. So
They all did.
maybe I should unpack that a little bit and kind of tell people like what these are, what they do. And
Yeah, let's get into the mitochondrial metabolic optimizers with the MOTS-C, the amino 1-MQ, 5-amino 1-MQ, the SS31. Let's without going way deep into the rabbit hole, again, we could have a 2-hour conversation on these.
Yeah.
Can you give just a general overview and some easy applications for these?
Yeah, so the Cliff Notes version, when we think about MOTS-C, it basically is going to help drive that AMPK pathway we talked about, and that ties in with insulin sensitivity. And it's through doing that, it's going to drive PTC1 alpha, which is going to increase mitochondrial biogenesis. And what that means, so that it's really digestible for people, when we talk about mitochondrial biogenesis, that's us having more mitochondria. And if we have more mitochondria, that means we can make and use energy a lot more efficiently. So that's definitely a good thing. It's got amazing effects in terms of increasing glucose uptake and oxidation. They're studying it for fatty liver and diabetes right now. So just to tie this in with our conversation about, how can we use this for hypertrophy? If you have somebody that's taking insulin and growth hormone, using MOTS-C with it is going to potentiate both of those by making sure that insulin is going to be specifically signaling to the muscle cell. And by increasing insulin sensitivity, it's going to mitigate some of the potential downside of growth hormone and its effects on insulin. So really cool peptide there.
Understood. And this is another subcutaneous injection?
Yeah, this would be a subcutaneous injection. Then the 5-amino 1-MQ, that one, so I've probably heard about people getting like an NAD IV.
Yeah.
And that's a horrible idea. The Cliff Notes version of why that's a horrible idea, when everybody's got cancer cells and we all have senescent cells, and these cancer and senescent cells upregulate. It's called CD38. I won't quiz anybody on that, but the way I want you guys to visualize this so it makes sense, just imagine these bad cells have like a really high powered magnet. And what happens when we dump that NAD in the system, this high power magnet on these bad cells sucks it up, and NAD energizes them. So, essentially you're giving energy to cancer cells and senescent cells. With 5-amino 1-MQ, the reason it's so cool, because we absolutely want NAD. It donates electrons so that our cells can work. With 5-amino 1-MQ, it's not dumping too much in our system where it's going to get sucked up by that magnet. We still have our normal NAD being produced, and when it comes out slow, the good cells can grab it, and the good cells will use it up before it gets to those bad cells. And the way that it preserves this NAD so only the good cells get it is it decreases. It's called NNMT, but I won't quiz anybody on that either. It decreases this NNMT that is going to be breaking down NAD. And the other thing that does, the other reason that's important, when we look at things like fibrosis, there's an increase in NNMT. So for people that are training and breaking down tissue, and we don't want, fibrosis, this 5-amino 1-MQ, all of a sudden we've got something that can increase energy production, mitochondrial oxidation. It can decrease the NNMT that's associated with fibrosis. And when we take it in the morning, because our NAD production is supposed to be high in the morning, it kind of anchors our circadian rhythm. So just a lot of cool things with that, and it's oral too. So anybody that's like, oh, I'm still not sold on giving myself a shot, this would be an option.
Got it. Okay, so this is I was just going to ask, but you just mentioned it. That's a first thing in the morning type application. What about with the MOTS-C? Would that be a pre-workout administration, or is that another first thing in the morning? Does timing matter?
Um, I would do it first thing in the morning on an empty stomach because that's going to be one of those times that we want to drive AMPK, especially if somebody's doing like fasted cardio, or you could potentially do it after a workout because you're in an energy depleted state. Um, if you were going to do that, I would use ketone esters with it and then postpone your post-workout drink for about 30 minutes and then, slam that post-workout shake.
Understood. And then here's a topic that I know a lot of people will be interested in, fat loss, right? A lot of people are looking towards peptides for a fat loss application.
Yeah.
What are some of the peptides that you see having legitimate value here?
In addition to the 2 mitochondrial peptides we talked about, the uh, the GLP agonists, and I say do a microdose of them. Doctors are taught to, start that somebody that will take tirzepatide, for example, 2.5 milligrams, and then, titrate up. But you don't have to titrate up, and you don't even need 2.5 milligrams sometimes. That if you have somebody do my weapon of choice is retatrutide, and retatrutide modulates GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon, and it affects your postprandial insulin response. So, you have that big meal and you kind of have that rise in blood sugars. It's going to keep that in check. And it's because it modulates that glucagon in there also, it's going to help with when you need it, breaking down nutrition and for an energy source, so you don't get that plummet in blood sugar. And when you stabilize somebody's blood sugars, one, that's going to improve insulin sensitivity, that's going to contribute to fat loss. Two, that's going to again, we're getting that glucose in the muscle cell, building more metabolically active tissue, so lots of benefits there. And with the retatrutide, instead of what most people start at with a dose, I simply do 1 milligram once a week. One of the funniest things I hear is people trying to reinvent the wheel by saying, oh, it'd be better off if you did like a microdose, like 0.3 milligrams every 3 days. And I tell people, if you're baking a cake and it says, make it at 350 for 10 minutes, you're not going to put it in there for 1,000 for 5 minutes and 0 for 5 minutes and 350. You're going to have a pretty jacked up cake. And when we talk about peptides and half-lives, like once a week is how these are designed to work. So we want to make sure we've got stability in terms of the levels in there. So that's really good. Another one that's really cool. This one's not really a peptide. It's more of a small molecule, but incredible, is the SLU PP332. And that one it's a ERA agonist. So it's estrogen related receptor agonist, and it upregulates mitochondrial genes. And it massively increases insulin sensitivity, and it's an exercise mimetic. So I don't know anybody that hates cardio more than me, but there's some reasons we do it. And if you can get that from taking essentially sending those signals through capsule, not saying you can get away with doing no cardio, but you can certainly get away with doing less cardio and really see some benefits for fat loss.
I was going to say, you said, exercise mimetic, a lot of ears are perking up out there. Oh, that means I can just sit on the couch and just take this peptide and, I'm just going to get shredded here. Okay. So you're not recommending that, right? You're saying that
it's a condition. Don't just become sedentary if you're going to use this.
Yeah, a good way to think about it. And MOTS-C is actually an exercise mimetic as well. Um, Basically, when we think about that, it's like going back to our analogy we talked about earlier, where you had the stereo. Um, when you exercise, you're sending a signal, and from that signal, there's going to be an adaptation. So this makes that signal clearer and louder. So there's going to be a more profound adaptation. Now, if you don't have that stimulus in the first place, there's going to be it would be like having the volume at 3. So you hear a little music and there's going to be some adaptation, but if you can turn it up to 10 and hook an amplifier up to it, that's going to be a heck of a lot more adaptation.
Understood. Are there any peptides out there that you see gaining traction that you think are not worth it? Any out there that you're like, what, these are gaining popularity and they shouldn't be, or they're just being significantly misapplied, things like that?
It's a really good question. I think all peptides, I joke with people, I've never met a peptide I don't like. So I think they all have utility, but absolutely what you're saying. I think there's a lot of misinformation around peptides, and I see a lot of um, people using them the wrong way. I don't know about one in specific off the top of my head, but it really comes down to when we think about these peptides and what they're doing, they're signaling molecules. And when we want to make sure, think about our training stimulus. What's the signal we're trying to send? So, for example, if we're in a hypertrophy phase and, we want to be a little bit more mTOR dominant than AMPK, we still need them both, but a little bit more mTOR. And, we're throwing all these, metform, like MOTS-C and a really high dose of it, and things that are going to be driving that AMPK, and we're taking them at the wrong time. So we're not, instead of like in the morning and then we work out in the afternoon, we take it immediately before our workout where we're increasing that AMPK signal, especially if, you do a pre-workout shake. It's kind of like, you're confusing your body and you're really not getting the most out of this peptide. So, yeah, I guess kind of when you're thinking about using these peptides, just make sure that think about what signal, what message you want to send, and make sure you're sending that message, and use the minimum amount of peptides to do that. That there's a lot of overlap with these, like when we think about the signaling pathways, and doesn't mean that you can't use two that use the same signaling pathway, but especially if you're going through a legitimate source, these are fairly expensive, and you're doing, 3. You want to have high growth hormone, but you're afraid to take growth hormone. So you're like, well, I'll do tesamorelin, sermorelin, and hexarelin all together. All 3 of those are working through the same mechanism of action, and that wouldn't be beneficial. It would make more sense to do like a tesamorelin, and like a GHRP,
Right.
than it would to do, GHRH type of combo.
Yeah. So, I mean, use the right tool for the job, right? You're not going to use a hammer when you should be using a screwdriver or vice versa, right? So these all have a specific application. Make sure that what you're utilizing it for, it's the correct tool for the job, and make sure that the dosing or the timing of it makes sense. So obviously there's a degree of research that is required for these. And then of course, make sure that you're getting it from a legitimate source. Just last question, just for some just practical knowledge. When you look at growth hormone, very fragile substance, right? It's sensitive to light, it's temperature. And if you drop it or you vigorously shake it, you can really compromise the integrity of the growth hormone. Is that true of most of these peptides? Should most of these be stored refrigerated, or at least the injectable versions, and not shaken and handled with care, similar to growth hormone?
Yeah, absolutely. If once they're reconstituted, you're going to want to keep them in a refrigerator, and when you put the water in, roll it in your hands. We're not trying to shake it, because remember, these are amino acids and they're joined together by this little peptide bond. And if we shake it too hard, we can break some of those bonds up, and not going to have the same message in place. So,
Right.
yeah, treat him like a baby.
Understood.
Delicate.
Well, Anthony, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up here. We've just about reached time, but I've got a lot to think about on my own end here. This was enlightening for me, and you know, I've never truly been bought into the peptides, and you know, I've just I don't want to say brush them off, but I haven't dedicated as much research to them as I'm thinking I now should. So thank you for just elaborating on a lot of these. I think I'm going to be incorporating some of the ones we talked about myself here. And I'll be curious just to pick your brain further off the air. But Anthony, where can people find you?
Yeah. So, uh, Instagram, I'm fairly active on there. It's just at and then my name Anthony Castore, Castore. I'll be speaking at the Peptide World Congress this year in June. That's going to be a really fun talk. I'm going to be talking about how do we take our workout and how do we use peptides strategically to amplify the benefits of the workout, the whole thought process behind that. And then the week before, I'll be speaking at the Athlete Builder Summit, Indianapolis. That's first weekend of June. Um, Feel free, anybody, I love to talk about this stuff. So reach out to me on Instagram. Happy to help any way I can. And thanks again for having me on your show. Really privileged to be on here with you and awesome conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, follow Anthony, look into his content, learn more about him. Just a brilliant mind on this topic. And I'm fired up that I was able to get you on the show. And guys, before you wrap up, just plugging for myself here. If anyone is interested in coaching for nutrition or training, you can go to my website, hammerchiselperformance.com, or you can DM me directly on Instagram. I'm very active on there. It's daily training, nutrition content. Episodes of this podcast coming out every Tuesday. And then, of course, go to troponensupplements.com, use code HECK, capital HECK at checkout for a discount. But anyway, Anthony, thank you so much for your time. And guys, we will catch you next week.
Thanks again.
Yes, sir.